Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
I am delighted and honored to be here before you today at the City Club. You know, City Clubs have a special place in America of ensuring that issues of great concern to Americans are freely expressed and freely discussed. And I'm very proud to be able to be here to talk about an issue that is of great controversy in this country. And I think it is important to have rational and thoughtful discussions. And I am just again honored to be here. I guess I was saying when you were introducing me and saying that I live half-time in Washington and half-time in rural Pennsylvania where my husband is, he would be glad to believe that. Unfortunately, it is not true that I am half-time in rural Pennsylvania. I also am very proud to be here because one of the strongest affiliates in our nation is housed right here in Portland and in Oregon. And I'm very proud of the work that it does to advance the principles and the values that underlie choice, and to ensure that Oregon voters know the difference between being pro-abortion and pro-choice. So I'm proud to be here on behalf of them as well. There's a bomber loose in America today. They think he's a man. He blew up the New Woman, all-women health care clinic in Birmingham, Alabama, just 2 weeks ago. He killed Robert Sanderson, an off-duty policeman hired to protect the staff and patients against threats and violence. And he left Emily Lyons, a clinic nurse, seriously wounded. According to a federal investigator, the bomb was not designed to damage property. It was designed to kill or injure people. Robert Samuelson and Emily Lyons join a list of 5 others killed and at least a dozen injured in assaults on women's health clinics since the early 1980s. Birmingham, unfortunately, is not new to hatred and violence. Many of you remember the civil rights marches, remember Bull Connor, remember the hoses and the dogs, remember the terror throughout the South as racism was backed down by a new conscience and a brand new justice. And remember the church bombings, people clinging to the old ways, people afraid and intolerant of change, of Washington's laws, who spent their fear and rage on black churches. Just when we think we've buried that era with all its hatred and violence, the churches are burning once again in America. The church burnings were all the more sensational because they were churches, houses of God. But the burners were not attacking churches or God. They were attacking the congregation that attends those churches. They were attacking African Americans because African Americans now live under the same laws as everyone else in America. They have the right to speak out, they have the right to vote, and they have the right to equal protection under the law. The fatal bombing in Birmingham just a few weeks ago was not just aimed at an abortion clinic. It was aimed at those inside, those who seek and those who perform abortions. It was aimed at a woman's constitutional right to make the most intimate and personal decision of her life. But just beneath the surface of the sensation over abortion, the attack was really an attack on women. On women who 25 years ago were acknowledged as having a freedom no less fundamental, no less monumental than the freedom to worship or the freedom to vote. Finally, Women had the freedom to choose whether or not and under what conditions we would bring a child into this world. The Birmingham bombing was an attack on the very precept of equality, of women having the right to choose for themselves, of not having to ask permission before making the most fundamental decision of their lives. It was an attack on the whole notion of women having conscience, of women worthy of respect and trust. Just as African Americans were given their full legal freedom just a generation ago, Roe v. Wade recognized a freedom so profound, a freedom so intimate, a freedom sometimes too personal for words. 25 years ago, I was one of the women who understood better than most what Roe really meant for women, because it came too late for me. Too late for my abortion, and too late for so many women, and so many tragedies that came before me. It was in 1970, the year that Roe came to court. I was a very young mother with 3 daughters under the age of 5. My entire life at that time was my family. Then one day, my husband announced very suddenly that he had fallen in love with another woman and that he was going to leave me and my 3 daughters. It was a very sudden and dramatic break. I was absolutely terrified. Suddenly, I was alone in my responsibility to my children. I was a homemaker at the time with no money, no job, no car, and no means to obtain one. My family was quickly forced onto welfare. Then, almost immediately after my husband left, I found that I was pregnant once again. I was devastated even further. Physically, financially, emotionally, I was simply not able to bring another child into the world. Like most women, and this is true about most women across the country, I never expected to even consider having an abortion. Women don't plan to have abortions. It's not something we think about like we do other opportunities that we plan for in our lives. We don't sit down and plan to get pregnant so that we can go out and have an abortion. I was a Catholic woman. Abortion was illegal. It was unspoken. It was shameful, and I knew that. I couldn't discuss abortion with my mother or my sister, let alone my priest. I had to struggle with the moral and ethical considerations in this decision all by myself. And I had to debate the obligations I had, the moral obligations I had to my 3 born children who were dependent solely on me for their entire well-being, against the responsibilities I felt to the developing life within me. In the end, I chose my children, and I had an abortion. But in those days, when abortion was illegal, it was not a choice I could make by myself. In order to have what was called then a therapeutic abortion, meaning an abortion in a hospital and not in the back alleys, I had to appear before an all-male hospital-appointed board. They asked terrible questions. They probed into the most intimate details of my life. I felt violated. I felt completely worthless. The only way that I could possibly get a safe and legal abortion, the only way that I could avoid putting myself at risk in the back alleys of this nation, was to convince them that I was unstable, that I was incapable of raising another child. I had 3 that I was raising, but I had to convince them that I couldn't raise children, that I was unfit to be a mother. But this inquisition had a final and most demeaning twist. The board finally did agree to grant me a hospital abortion. I was admitted to the hospital, only to be told by a nurse that they had forgotten one more legal requirement. Before I could have the abortion, I had to get the written permission from the man who abandoned me and our daughters. I had to literally leave the hospital, search for him, get his permission, and then have the abortion. I found him, he gave me his permission, and I had the abortion. When I've told this story, and people have said to me, well, why didn't you just try to get around the law? It never occurred to me to try to get around the law. I was completely devastated. I had no self-worth. Everything that happened to me said to me I was not worthy of making this decision. I was not trusted. How could I ever have thought to even begin to get around the law? It never occurred to me. So I humiliated myself further, and I got his written permission. So when Roe was handed down, I was quite overcome. It was the day Lyndon Johnson died, but I remembered and responded to the headlines that said that women had a right to choose. It was somehow, to me, a benediction, a retroactive reprieve that helped restore my sense of worth, my integrity as a person. Finally, so many thousands of ordinary women, women in crisis, women in despair, had been pardoned for our crimes, had finally been elevated to true citizenship. 25 years ago, Roe versus Wade, like all verdicts of that magnitude, at first it was an abstraction, a principle wrapped in great American values: liberty, equality, trust. So absolutely large, so filled with potential that most women, especially those who were to benefit the most, could not grasp it at once. That each woman had the legal right to end her pregnancy, that no woman ever again would be forced to risk her life or her fertility with a back alley abortion, that every woman could openly talk to her doctor about abortion and have one, a legal one, a safe one, that government and politicians would remain neutral, would remain remote in our decision whether or not to continue a pregnancy. No one, simply no one, had the power to interfere with this most intimate and personal of choices. Not the president, not the Congress, not the courts, not the bureaucrats. Roe versus Wade. Suddenly, an entire legal history of discrimination had been turned on its head. Suddenly, women in crisis and the doctors who helped them were no longer criminals. A new civil right had been granted, a new tolerance had been demanded, and a new moral debate had been begun. In the end, Roe versus Wade was as much about the past as the future. It was as much an indictment, as much an apology, as it was a promise. It was an indictment of our blindness, not to see into the heart and mind of every woman. An indictment of a people who doubted a woman's powerful sense of responsibility, not just for her own life, but for the future of her family. It was an apology to the millions of women who were bound to live in despair for lack of any legal safe means to prevent unwanted children. An apology to those who died breaking the law. In a larger sense, it was an apology, come very late, that women were never acknowledged in our original Constitution. For all of us, for all women, Roe was the last legal stop, the final judgment that reproductive choice is critical to a woman's continued progress toward full and equal participation in American life. It was a national promise. It was a federal guarantee that was ours forever and ever. Forever and ever, we could count on the right to choose with privacy and with dignity. Forever and ever, we had control of our reproductive decisions. Forever and ever, we would live without fear, without violation, without humiliation, and without violence. How very wrong we were. 25 years later, we're still fighting battles we thought we had won that day, defending ground that had long been ours. 25 years later, we're still up against intolerance and intimidation. Women suffer harassment outside of clinics. Doctors are killed and their families threatened. Doctors performing the most common surgery in America today. Doctors doing fetal tissue research at universities like Yale University, trying to find cures for Hodgkin's, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. Some doctors are denied malpractice insurance and research grants as punishment. Shareholders turn on corporations that give to charities involved with women's reproductive choice. 25 years later, we're still up against the same zealous forces that denied our rights for so long. Up against the same intolerance and arrogance that drive forward their cause to take back a woman's freedom to choose. Some are the extreme right, the Christian Coalition, Pat Robertson. They are the Catholic bishops. They are the members of the United States Congress. They govern state houses. They write state laws. They preach from the pulpit. They sit in county courthouses. They are elected to boards of education and to hospital boards and library committees. Roe's promise to women of the right to choose an abortion free from government interference remains under constant daily siege. Of 435 representatives in the House, only 121 are pro-choice today. In the Senate, they number 33 out of 100. Our opponents chair most of the committees that have jurisdiction over women's reproductive health. They control much of the machinery that determines which bills get an open vote and which bills never make it to the floor. Since 1995, we've faced 82 votes to limit reproductive choice, including family planning services, and we lost all but 10 of those votes. That is an unprecedented number of votes on an issue of any nature in that space of time. Whether it's the high-profile debate on late-term abortion or the ban on fetal tissue research, this Congress continues to reopen the most fundamental questions answered in Roe. Who, this is the question, who should decide whether or not to have a child? Who should be the final arbiter in her choice? Should it be Pat Robertson, Newt Gingrich, Jesse Helms, a federal bureaucrat, a county judge, or should it be the woman with her family or her doctor or her minister or her rabbi or whomever she decides to consult with in this very, very important choice? Our opponents are as sophisticated as they are willful. They've learned not to attack Roe directly. Instead, they come from the flanks. They come to cripple Roe. They know the impact of sensationalism. They know how to shock and alarm, how to distract Americans from the central question in this whole debate: who should decide? Across the country, anti-choice politicians are trying to convince voters that Roe versus Wade will remain the law of the land, but that legal abortion demands a few so-called safeguards around the edges. That's the new tactic of politicians. In fact, in many ways, I think it was born right here in your state of Oregon with Senator Smith, actually, where they try to make the voter believe that they're not a threat to their constitutional right to privacy and to choice, but indeed they would support every measure put forth by anti-choice people who want to take down this right. Well, these safeguards that they say they would support have gone a long way to cripple Roe, to make the choice to have an abortion more complicated, more difficult, and less accessible for the women at risk. In fact, 4 years ago, Chief Justice Rehnquist put it quite bluntly. He said, and I quote, "Roe continues to exist, but only in the way a storefront on a Western movie set exists, a mere facade to give the illusion of reality." In state houses from Maine to Arizona, we're forced to fight a steady assault of anti-choice legislation. Last year, 1997, 405 bills introduced. all raising a cruel barrier between women in crisis and the guarantees of Roe. Through waiting periods, parental consent, state-mandated lectures, simple harassment, simple intimidation, simple obstruction, all aimed at taking back Roe, except by name, all aimed at taking America back to a time when women were just expected to bear and raise children, and only that. A time when sexuality was hidden and unspoken, a time of intolerance, a time before Roe. The real victims of this strategy? The silent women, as I call them, remote from government. Silent women who don't expect help, silent women who don't march. Too often they're women with little income and even less education. Women who live in the remotest corners of America and in our inner cities. African American, Native American, Latina, white. The silent women. They're teenagers, new to sexuality, driven by peer pressure and fantasy, looking for recognition, completely unready to raise a child, unprepared for the costs, unable to give it a secure home. How we respond to these silent women, how we respond to the millions of women of childbearing age, rests, I believe, on who we really are as a people. What we really believe is the American way. Abortion is not the question. The question is values. The value we put on a woman's life, the value we put on her decision and her choice to bear a child, and the value we put on rearing that child. That's what the issues are. Our struggle today is about much more than keeping abortion legal. It's about protecting a right that is so fundamental to us as a people. A woman's complete freedom to measure and decide when the circumstances are right to bring a child into the world and when they are not. A right that is central to all rights that express the integrity of person and individual conscience. I would argue that the decision to bear a child is the most morally important decision any of us will ever make in our lives. And as long as the right wing succeeds in fixating America with the act of abortion, they succeed in diverting us, in distorting us from the real freedom that is at stake. They succeed in preventing us from all moving beyond the fundamental guarantees of Roe versus Wade to the critical fight for a country committed to bringing up healthy, secure children. As long as they keep NARAL and others like us defending the right to an abortion, they obscure and delay the national focus on the larger pro-choice mission. They prevent us from giving women the support to make the best choice, to do everything we can to make women's decisions informed decisions, to reduce crisis pregnancies, to reduce the need for abortion, to spare unwanted children, to make abortion less necessary. That's what our nation's goal should be, to make abortion less necessary, not more difficult and dangerous. Our job must be to give men and women the means to manage their reproductive lives, to teach our children how to avoid unintended pregnancy, to make available contraception, to provide the health care that help women carry wanted, healthy pregnancies to term. That we as a nation have failed to respond to this dramatic need is starkly evident. Today, nearly 60% of all pregnancies are unplanned pregnancies. That's 3 million unintended pregnancies every single year, 1 million of them among teenagers. Half of them end in abortion. This is not just a problem facing teenagers or unmarried women. An estimated 40% of all pregnancies to married women are unintended. Birth control failures. We don't have a perfect birth control. And in fact, we have fewer options than any developed country in the world to prevent pregnancy. Compound these dramatic statistics by the sometimes trauma of poverty, crime, illiteracy, and the cost of despair and neglect goes far higher. Add lives without opportunity, without dream, without hope, and the nation's shame widens. We've already lost too many at a cost that no amount of money can reverse. But we must move beyond abortion. We must focus on developing a coherent national policy on sexual and reproductive health and begin the massive task of rebuilding America's human infrastructure. Now, I know you hear our leaders talk about investing in the future. If the most critical investment we can make isn't to bring into this world healthy, wanted, secure children, then I'm not sure what it is. We can talk about education, we can talk about putting people to work, about safe streets, about the goals of a society. But we must remember something very important. Our society begins in a single moment, the moment that a woman becomes pregnant. What we become as a nation, who we are, hangs on our concern for that decision and our preparation for that moment. A healthy society comes down to whether we have educated our young to make responsible choices, whether we have prepared them to understand their own sexuality, whether we have taught them the consequences of having sex, whether we have adequately explained the connection between having a family and supporting a family, whether we can guarantee sound health care for those women who choose to have a child before and after birth. That is the measure of a caring and intelligent nation. What kind of opportunities we guarantee, what kind of rights we defend. I am reminded that Eleanor Roosevelt was once asked, "Where do rights begin?" She responded, "In small places, close to home, so close and so small they cannot be seen on any map of the world. Yet they are in the world of the individual person, where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless rights have meaning there," she said, "they have little meaning everywhere." She speaks eloquently to African Americans in their churches. She speaks eloquently to women in their clinics. But most of all, she speaks eloquently to those who would undo equal justice, equal opportunity, and equal dignity without discrimination. Those intolerant of those rights, those who would take back these rights without regard for the consequences. Sadly, American women will leave this century still fighting for a freedom that we thought we had won 25 years ago. We do remain frustrated still to be fighting the same indignities, the same intolerance, the same mindlessness that gave birth to this fundamental human right. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness rings hollow for us without a deeper national commitment to choice. Because without the complete freedom to choose our own reproductive path is to fully enjoy none of them. Because if we are not the final arbiters in that decision, then our lives are not truly our own, and we are denied full and equal citizenship in America. We gather today in this year anniversary to celebrate Roe, to pay our respects to the court, to applaud our early pro-choice pioneers, to thank all the political leaders who voted their conscience, to remember the women who suffered and died before Roe, and to alert America that Roe is at risk. We know what lies ahead. We understand the ebb and flow of the political will to protect a woman's right to choose. We are seasoned veterans in the struggle against zealous opponents who are well organized and often better financed. We know they will carry their attacks beyond honest disagreement and rational debate. that they will try to keep America fixed on abortion rather than seek ways to make abortion less necessary. They will continue to try and isolate reproductive choice from other constitutional freedoms, to demean this basic of fundamental values until the nation no longer grasps its intense meaning to women and their families and to the nation as a whole. If they succeed, if they deceive enough people, Roe will become no more than a distant experiment. So I must ask you for your help today to hand the full guarantees of this fundamental value and right down to our children and our grandchildren, to my granddaughter and your granddaughters. Because only if we act today, only if we convince our neighbors and our leaders to protect the freedom that is embedded in Roe and the value that is choice, can we cross safely into the next century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. I am so proud and so pleased to have you here today. This is really, really wonderful. Listening to you speak and realizing the many, many questions I could ask, I feel particularly aware of the population changing in Oregon and Northwest and many parts of the country. This is such a women's issue, and it's such an issue of power, and the power that we have over our own lives. And I feel empathy and sorrow for the women that I see that are Hispanic, African American, Asian, the minority women who are so faith-based. And as a cradle Catholic like you, the messages that we have not been pro-choice. How do we reach out to those women and get them to join us and to help us and be part of this, this tremendous movement?
It's a very important question. That this is a freedom that women of all colors, of all economic means, need to have guaranteed. And we also need to ensure that women in those communities in particular that you mentioned understand that reproductive choice, the freedom that we're fighting for and defending, is a freedom to decide when it is right for them to bring a child into the world, and the freedom for them to bring a child into the world in a healthy way. So that, because I believe that pro-choice has been labeled as pro-abortion, and for those women in those communities, that is a difficult concept. I mean, for anyone it is. But they're particularly concerned with health issues related to pregnancy care, maternal care, of access to birth control, of access to health care in general, and they may not see abortion, if you will, that specific medical service, as the most important one for them, and dismiss perhaps the pro-choice movement as not really speaking to their broader health needs. Well, that's only because the other side, those who are opponents of choice, have somewhat successfully defined choice more narrowly, because this is an issue, as I said earlier, that goes much beyond abortion. It is about being able to have a child in a healthy, planned way, being able to have access to birth control, being able to have sexuality education that really informs people. So I do think we need to reach across and ensure that we involve people of all communities in fighting for this very most basic of rights. And one thing you said that I would like to just comment on, you said this is a right that is a woman's right. It is indeed most personally and most profoundly a right that affects women. But you know, because it's a freedom that is inextricably linked to all other freedoms, it's also about the freedom to worship, the freedom to believe. It's about the freedom to speech, the freedom to vote. It's inextricably linked. And if you take one right away, all of us, men and women, are affected because of the link, the interwovenness of these constitutional liberties.
John, excuse me, John Wool, City Club member.
Hi, John.
The French pill has had numerous obstacles
Yes.
in the way. My question is, will the U.S. have it legally before the next presidential election?
Good question. Excellent question, because let me just step back and take you back to 1992 when we were working to elect the first pro-choice president in 16 years. After 3 administrations of anti-choice administrations, we had seen the Supreme Court move very dramatically toward overruling Roe. We had had a ban on importing RU46, also known as mifepristone, which is a medical alternative to surgical abortion that allows women who need to terminate their pregnancies to use a medical procedure that acts within 5 to 7 weeks of pregnancy. There was an import ban, and after the election of President Clinton, the first day in office, he signed an executive order lifting the import ban, which meant that it could come into this country, go through the proper field testing to reach the mandates and the levels of efficacy that the Food and Drug Administration in this country demand. In fact, it did get into this country. It was brought in. It did go through field testing. In fact, I think one of the tests was right here in Portland, one of the sites, so that it could be, it had already been, by the way, in France and in England through enormous years of testing. But we have high standards here, and that is good. So it went through the testing here, and it met the standards of the FDA, although there were still some protocols to be developed. But the option is still not available to American women, and it's run into political problems as well as others. But I will say that I think, if I'm not being too optimistic, I hope and believe that it will be available to women in America by the end of 1999. I hope I'm not wrong about that, but I think that we will meet the goal of having it available here before the next election. It is an incredible situation when a medical opportunity has to be shrouded in secrecy, that the manufacturers of this pill have to be kept under wraps. They can't even be, it's almost impossible to even have them in the United States of America because of the threats and the violence. So it's taken a very long time to overcome these obstacles to make sure that American women have available to them what French women have had for years, what English women have had, Swedish women, and it also enables women to terminate earlier in their pregnancies. And I think we would all agree, if a woman needs to have an abortion, we need her to have available early access, because as a pregnancy continues, the issues, moral and otherwise, get much more complicated and difficult. And so I hope I'm not disappointed, and we aren't, but I think because in the year 2000, when we have a next presidential election, if it isn't available in this country, and if we were to get an anti-choice president in the White House, it could stop it right in its tracks. Diane.
Good afternoon, Kate.
Hi.
Diane Lynn, City Club member, and I've had the pleasure and honor to work with you, Kate, when I was Executive Director of Oregon NARAL prior to Lisa Horowitz 4 years ago. My question, and I'm planning, I hope, to take this agenda onto the Multnomah County Commission as a candidate for that. Thank you. My question, Kate, is in our effort to pursue the question of diminishing the need for abortion, which so many of us are so committed to, especially through our teen clinic programs and other ways. Have you heard of, do you have any sense that we're moving in the direction with technologies to provide more alternatives in terms of contraceptives?
Very important question. As I said, and I will reiterate because I think it is so important, that our nation's goal should be to make abortion less necessary. And then we need to not just say that as a slogan. We need to take measures to make it a priority and to advance access to information and health care that will actually result in reducing the need. In terms of contraceptive options. And there are several ways, by the way, that we can advance the goal that the Institute of Medicine has laid out for us, by the way. The Institute of Medicine in 1996, I believe, issued a report, very thorough and fairly dramatic report, on the problem of unintended pregnancy and reproductive health issues that I mentioned. And they said, we as a nation ought to work toward a new national norm. And that new national norm they described as achieving a time when every pregnancy is consciously desired at the time of conception. Now that's an extraordinary goal. Every pregnancy is consciously desired. It's planned, it's thought about, and desired at the time of conception. Well, you know how many months in the life of a woman that we are capable of getting pregnant. It's a and we don't have perfect methods, and we don't even have enough of them, and it's a mess here. I don't know how we get, but I'm an optimistic person, and my staff will tell you I'm much more of a visionary than I am capable of achieving. But I think I've made it kind of a big thing at NARAL, consciousness new national norm. So what are the small steps and then the steps that we need to take to achieve that? Well, one is we need to have more, we need to press for, and we are at National NARAL, at the federal level, pressing for more funding and support for reproductive technology. That has been stopped, by the way. Over in the years of the Reagan-Bush administrations, money dried up for reproductive technology and research. And in fact, American pharmaceutical companies used to be the leaders in reproductive technology. They're at the bottom of the barrel now. The French, the English, I mean, everybody's out there. And it's not just the anti-abortion politics. It is that, in part. It's also the litigation, and we're a very litigious nation, as you know, but it's the combination that have really just moved companies out of, so we need to increase. We need to have a commitment nationally to expanding the numbers of options. And research funds have really diminished. And so they're not being pushed. The other thing is that we need, and we're working on both at the federal and state level, mandates that health insurance, private health insurance companies cover contraceptive care. You realize that most health insurance companies do not cover contraceptive care. So they relegate it sort of as not important. Well, remember, for women, reproductive health care is primary health care. And so if it's not covered, it leaves out lots of women. It's a mandate that we are working to achieve, and in fact, in certain states around the country last year, through legislation, we have actually gotten a few states to mandate coverage. Emergency contraception's been available to European women, well known and available. Emergency contraception is a high-dose contraceptive that works within 72 hours after sexual intercourse to prevent an unintended pregnancy. You know what? American women have no idea it exists. They have no idea. And there are lots of reasons for that. We only have a short time. But we are, and NARAL and Planned Parenthood and other organizations are fighting to make information about the availability of emergency contraceptive known, and because fewer than 1% of women at risk even know about the availability of emergency contraception. So there are things in the works. We have a way to go. But I'll tell you what, if we don't elevate these issues to a higher level of importance in our nation, childbearing, reproductive, and sexual health, we are never going to put behind it the power that we need to make it important and to ensure that the tools and the conditions are there to make informed reproductive and sexual decisions good. I mean, make that a reality. And until we do, you know, we just talk a good game, but we really don't deliver. I'm sorry.
Don't apologize.
I could go on and on and on. And anyway.
My name is Pete Heuser. I'm a City Club member.
Oh, hi,
I think it's
Pete.
fairly easy to understand that women should have the right to choose. You alluded briefly, though, to government funding of family planning, birth control, and the like. Maybe you can talk a bit about government funding of abortion. I think practically speaking, we understand that the government must fund some of these things because the women who can't afford to have a child can't afford to have an abortion. But, of course, almost half of the nation is opposed to it. A substantial minority is violently opposed to it. How can you justify government funding where there is that opposition?
That's a very good question as well. There are many, many people in the nation who are opposed to abortion and feel very strongly that their tax dollars should not go to support a woman who is poor and depends on the federal government for her health care to support her option to have an abortion. Now, the federal government does pay for her prenatal care and her child delivery care if she chooses to have a child. And I do understand that point of view. I do. The reason I feel very strongly about funding for abortion is the following. And I hope this makes a lot of sense. There are people who believe, there are even people who are very pro-choice but stop short at supporting funding because they believe that government should not be involved in these decisions, which is, I think, is probably the basic principle that government and politicians have no business in our private reproductive decisions. But they believe that encouraging funding on the part of government involves government in those decisions. I would argue just the opposite. I would argue that when women are poor enough to have to depend on the government, whether it's state or federal, to ensure their health care, for the government to reach into that woman's health care plan and take out one option of hers is the height of government interference into her decisions. That health care is, for women, is reproductive health care, and that for these women, sometimes continuing a pregnancy is a risk to her health. And if she can't exercise through her health care plan medical options that protect her health, she is at risk. And I think it's wrong for the government to put women who just happen to be disadvantaged in that position. I also think it's quite discriminatory. Though again, I will reiterate, I do appreciate and understand how those who are opposed to abortion would be opposed to this principle. I also would make one third argument, that there are those of us who are morally opposed to a number of things that the government may choose to have to do. I mean this very sincerely as a person who feels very strongly morally about certain activities that we engage in as a nation. And I don't want my tax dollars paying for it. I don't have a line item veto. The government can't allow us as individuals to have a line item veto to exercise every conscientious objection we might have, and I understand that as well. And it was difficult for me to know as a conscientious person that my tax dollars were going to support some activities that I am morally opposed to. But anyway, so though I understand, I think the issues involved in funding for women have to do with discrimination against women who are poor, protecting their health and ensuring the full range of health care options, and not allowing us to be dictated by, you know, policies that are driven by just some. Yes.
I'm Dr. Joseph Husterman, City Club member. And when I learned that you were speaking today, I called the City Club to find out when somebody perhaps from National Right to Life would also be speaking to present perhaps the opposite viewpoint. And I learned to my dismay that there were no plans to have any speakers presenting the opposite point of view. And I was very dismayed because I had joined the City Club hoping that it would represent different, very difficult positions equally. I just want to hope that that doesn't change, because I would like to continue to belong to the club. My question is for you. You and your associates seem to invocate choice, almost raising it to a sacrosanct status to justify what many of us who believe in the sanctity of life consider to be the latest Holocaust and the ultimate violence of destroying innocent human life, even to taking the lives of the about to be born. It makes me ask if you believe that freedom of choice justifies any and all far less violent actions. I'm concerned when you kind of demonize the government also, because we are the government, the people are the government. And we look back, some of us who are old enough look back at Hitler's Holocaust, and of course that was also made legal by the legal fraternity in Germany. So we have concerns about when something may be legal but not necessarily moral. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. First of all, I must say on your last point, to compare a woman's decision about whether or not to continue a pregnancy to the horror of the Holocaust, I think is an insult on all levels. And I will also say that there are times in our lives that we do decide that we sacrifice life. We're sending troops right now to Iraq. Now, we all may disagree on the rightness or wrongness of that action, but we're not deciding, are we? We the government. We're sacrificing life on behalf of something I guess we believe is important, that we protect against weapons of mass destruction. At least that's the goal. So there are times when we do disagree with certain acts, but there are greater goods or greater values that need to be addressed. And I believe, I respect that there are people who believe that every fertilized egg is a full human being. You obviously believe that. I don't happen to believe that, and not everyone. I believe it's a form of life and it's living. It's living, but it is not a full human being. It can't live outside the woman. And sometimes a woman has to make the moral decision about whether or not to bring that child into the world. And I think bringing a child into the world involves enormous moral responsibilities, and sometimes she's pregnant when she can't be, and she can't meet those moral responsibilities. And I think she has to have the right to decide whether it is more right for her to end a pregnancy than it is to bring a child into the world that she cannot nurture and grow. But the issue of when life begins is one that has never been uniformly agreed upon. People today and across the millennium have differed on that question, and I think it's by and large a moral and religious ethical question. And that's why I say to you, these decisions and these questions need to be answered by the woman and not by law. But I think we ought to do more to make abortion less necessary so fewer women have to face the decision. Do we have time? I hope.
Very quickly.
Sorry.
As a 35-year member of the club, I want to acknowledge that the program committee is not responsible to find all speakers on all subjects when they're filling the program, although in our research obligation, of course, it is intended that there be debate on all issues.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you a question we may not have time for you to answer, but
especially since I'm
the
so
percentage of doctors and hospitals that provide counseling and abortion service, the percentage of doctors who will not, and the percentage of medical schools that do not provide training. Can you give me some comment
A very
about
quick answer. It's a very important question. As a result of anti-abortion politics and violence, the numbers of doctors able and willing to provide the service has dropped dramatically over the last 10 years. We have like a 40% decline in the number of physicians. In terms of teaching hospitals that are requiring that OBGYN residents learn how to do an abortion, that has dropped due to pressure by anti-abortion people. It used to be, I might get this statistic wrong, and it was, 60%, 70% of all hospitals. Now it's down to about 12. In fact, there was a New York Times article recently in the New York Times Magazine with a doctor on the cover with a mask, and he talks about abortion being the only procedure that he's able to opt out of learning how to do. There's a serious problem in the service delivery area, not just because of violence, but because of the pressure of anti-abortion activists on these hospitals and on teaching. And doctors who are pro-choice, many of them are not even willing to provide services. So this is going to be a continuing problem as we develop over the years.